Morning, everybody. I'm broadcasting from the dog park today. Hope you're doing well. I hope you've had a chance to go outside over the last few days and just enjoy the weather. Um, I find for me at least, it really helps to go outside, go walk through a park. We do have a dog park down here where I take our little dog Max, and he certainly enjoys it, and I enjoy it too. It's just nice to see people walking around and being friendly, even if you can't always see their smiles because of the mask they're wearing. But just seeing people walking around, it makes kind of life a little bit normal, and certainly getting pleasure out of watching the dogs run around helps too. So I hope you're all doing well, hanging in there. Just finding ways to distract yourself. Hopefully, you're able to distract yourself a little bit by this course. And I wanted to talk about the exam coming up. Hopefully, not stressing you out too much. I'll do whatever I can to make sure that's the case. Let's go ahead and make myself a person, not a doggy. There we go. Oh, it's always such a disappointment, isn't it? I don't know if you feel like this, but whenever I change from an animal, whatever I am, a pirate, and then go back to regular old Rosamund, it's like, there I am again. I prefer being a doggy. Maybe at some point I'll teach the entire lecture as some sort of animal. Anyway, a couple of things I wanted to mention. Actually, there's one thing I wanted to talk to you folks about. I'm pretty sure most of you are aware of what this law coming out about foreign students not being able to maintain residency, not being able to keep their visa, if in fact they're at a university that's going to have courses online like UC is going to. And if you've been following, you might know first, you might yourself might be in this situation, a foreign student who's here on a visa to take classes, or you might know some folks, you might have some friends or family members or something like that. And I can imagine that on top of everything, that this has added so much stress to those of you that are dealing with this personally. But I just wanted to mention a little bit as having, a tiny bit of contact with folks that are in charge of this. First of all, you might have heard today that along with MIT and Harvard, the entire University of California system is bringing a lawsuit against the executive branch, the government, to try to stop this law from occurring. But even if that doesn't work out, it has a number of things, the university has a number of things to fall back on. So it is being addressed very seriously, and I have, a lot of confidence that it will be taken care of, even if it means that we set up some symbolic courses, like 1-credit course or something, where you do come on campus and meet with other students at a very safe distance, just for a very brief time, in a very safe context. There are things we can do. So hopefully for those of you that are either dealing with this personally or dealing with this with family members, that does relieve some of the stress. The university is very on top of it. We very much care about every student, but right now particularly these foreign students having to deal with this. So again, hopefully that relieves some of the stress. But if you have any questions, go ahead and post some questions on that. I'd be happy to answer them. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and post information on the test. Oops, hold on a second. I'll share my screen and get that information up here. There we go. Okay. So starting midnight tonight, you will be able to take the test in any 80-minute period, and that will run through Sunday at midnight. So you'll be given 3 full days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, to take the test anytime you'd like. Once you take the test, it has to be completed in that 80-minute period. So make sure when you sit down, you've got everything you need. It is open book, and this is just the second time I've given an open book test in this class, and it seemed to go okay last quarter, but I want to make sure that you are aware of what open book means. First of all, even though it's open book, it must be taken alone. I don't want people collaborating over Zoom or anything like that. That's cheating. But open book means you can use any of the resources that you have organized for yourself, whether it's your own notes and your own outline, the slides, the lecture recordings if you want, but I think that's going to be pretty difficult to use during the actual test. The book you can have handy, of course, too. Just because it's open book, and I know I'm kind of speaking to the choir here in a sense, because the folks that are coming to class regularly, attending live, I don't really have much concern that you would know that even though it is open book, that you have to study. 80 minutes is not going to give you enough time for 60 questions to look up the answer for a majority of them or anything like that. If it were me taking this test, this is exactly how I would do it. I would go through the test and try to answer all the questions I could without, using resources, but I would mark or at least write down somehow the answers that you have questions on. And you will definitely be able to go back and revise your answer, change your answer based on that. Okay, so, I don't know if you're actually able to make notes on the test, but even if you're not, that's not really an issue. Go through the test and say, well, I'm not sure if the answer to question 6, I'll have to look that up, and keep going. Oh, I'm not sure of the answer to question 13, I'll have to look up that. And after you're done getting all the answers in that you can, then go back, and you'll probably have some time at that point, 15 minutes or so, and go ahead and look these answers up quickly if you need to. But the point is, you should come in really having studied, ready to take the exam. Okay? Covers everything through, from what we learned in the beginning of the class through much of today's lecture. I'm going to finish talking about taste today, and then I will start talking about touch. At that point, we'll be covering material that will be tested on the final exam, not the midterm exam. And I'll remind you of that when we get there. All section material through last week's section. So on Monday, Serena taught some things on touch, and then she told you there's a video to watch. Helen Keller, hopefully she linked that for you, and you can watch that when you want before the final. But this week's material on touch won't be tested until the final exam. Okay? And then all the book material through chapter 5, which is on taste, including the preface. Please read through the preface. There are a couple of things there that I want you to catch. That should be it. It's very straightforward. You've gotten about a third of the questions already because of the practice questions we're doing in class. Those will look familiar to you, and you should do fine on those. Go ahead and print those out with you at the test, and you'll know the answers to those. Everyone should get 20 correct at least. I'm trying to make this as less as give you as little stress as possible. That being said, I also want you to learn. I want you to be able to gain something from the course. You or your family paid good money for this, and I want you to learn things, and I want you to be able to learn things that you'll then be able to potentially apply to other courses, other aspects of your life or whatever. So it is a real course. Okay. All right. Let me see if there's any questions. And as I said, I'd be happy to answer questions on this issue with regard to foreign students on visas if anyone is dealing with that or knows somebody dealing with that. But I'd be happy to answer questions on the exam as well. Oh, you know something? I haven't heard back yet from Serena, but I do want to make sure that she did cover the diaper story, why mothers prefer their own child's diaper, what the reason for that might be. Did she cover that in discussion section? If she didn't, I can just very quickly tell you about that. Did Serena cover the issue about diaper changing and smell? Can somebody just tell me? Do you remember if she did cover that in discussion section? She did. Good. Okay. If you didn't make it, go to that particular discussion section. You can certainly look at her video, but it's also in the book, and it's very clear. That has to do, just to remind you, about potentially the intestinal flora of the infant, which is going to provide a scent to the soiled diaper, is similar in intestinal flora to one's own biology, and therefore there will be a commonality there, and that is thought to play a role in it being less offensive to the mother when she's cleaning the diaper. Okay. All right, any questions on anything? Any questions having to do with the exam? Any questions having to do with any of the material or this issue with foreign students? Anything I can do to make you feel better? Hopefully you're not that stressed. Are you feeling stressed? Hopefully not. It's summer and you know, probably this is the one class you're taking. It shouldn't be too bad. All right. Okay. All right, then we will continue with the material and actually get into a story I think that's really interesting. This is one of my favorite interviews I did in the book we'll be talking about soon, and that's with the master sommelier, Stephen Poe, I think is his name. By the way, you might notice I get confused about the names of these people I interviewed. There's 30 in the book, and I actually interviewed like 3 times more than that. If I don't remember the names, I'm not really expecting you to remember the names. You know, I might make reference to somebody like expert echolocator Daniel Kish, but I will never ask you who's the expert echolocator. Is it Daniel Kish, Stephen Poe, John Bramblett, that sort of thing? You're not responsible for remembering the names of these people I interviewed. Okay, I don't remember them. I have to be reminded. I remember the interviews really well, and this interview was really, really fascinating for me. Hopefully you'll feel the same way as we go through it. All right, any questions? All right, let's go ahead then and start our lecture for today. So just to remind you what we've been talking about, we're into taste. And what we noticed about taste is that despite our intuitions of what taste might be like, that we experience flavor on our tongues, we've already seen evidence that our sight has a significant influence on how things taste, right? This example of my own experience in a dark restaurant, I think, is just very clear. Food didn't taste as good. Food didn't taste as intense. It tasted bland. And that's it turns out, after I got home and read the research, it's a known thing. You know, people who wear blindfolds and then you know, eat or something, or lose their vision spontaneously, they'll absolutely complain of the same thing. You know, as I said, drink manufacturers know about this, where the intensity of the color of, say, your Dragonberry Powerade will determine how strong it tastes, even if the flavor itself really isn't that strong. And then we got into these other things having to do with sound, and we talked about the fact that you wouldn't normally think this is relevant, but how loud something that has a crunch to its sounds will also have an influence on how something tastes. This is a really kind of fun experiment where people were just eating Pringles again and again, but were asked, they weren't told that. They said these are different potato chips, and they thought they were different potato chips and rated how much they liked the potato chips and how fresh they thought the potato chips were based on the sound they were hearing as they were chewing. And this was done through manipulating the sound that was coming through the headphones as they were chewing, and it had a significant effect. And again, it's not just a significant effect on whether it was crisp or stale, but it was a significant effect on how much they liked it. I probably should have put that on the slide too, but you get the idea. The louder, the brighter, the crisper it sounded to them, and the more they liked it. The quieter, the duller, like turning up the bass control on your stereo. And turning down the treble control on your stereo, the more they thought it was stale and the less they liked it. Makes perfect sense. So right now we know 3 things because you learned something in discussion section. Taste, even though it seems that we taste things on our tongue, actually is influenced by things that are deeper than that, things that are in our brain. We know that sight influences how something tastes dramatically, right? Hearing influences how something tastes, as I just reviewed for you. And as you know from discussion section, smell. And smell is thought to have possibly the greatest influence on how things taste. And hopefully, you know, if you went along with Serena's demonstration, you got a really good feel for that. You know, the way we typically do that, by the way, in our discussion sections when we're meeting live, is we pass out jelly beans to everybody and tell them not to look at the color of the jelly bean, to close their eyes, and then plug their nose with their eyes closed, okay, and put the jelly bean in their mouth and start chewing it and try to guess the flavor, and they can't. And then open up their nose, and the flavor rushes in, and they can tell, well, I could tell it was sweet before I opened up my nose, but now I can tell it's licorice. Now I can tell it's chocolate. Now I can tell it's banana. And it's a very compelling sort of effect. And that sort of thing, and the sort of, you know, discussion we had about Carl Vench and his anosmia, suggests that, yeah, our sense of flavor is strongly influenced by our sense of smell. But the big picture here so far is that our sense of taste is one of our most multi-sensory experiences, right? So vision affects it, hearing affects it, and smell affects it largely, okay? And as it turns out, so does touch, okay? So what do we mean by this? I'm going to give you many examples of this, but I'm going to show you how deep this actually occurs. So you might know something from other classes about how your taste buds are spread across your tongue, right? They're not evenly spread across the tongue, right? It's not like every area of the tongue has an equal proportion of the different types of taste buds we have. And that's what this image is showing, that we have a lot of sweet taste buds that are sensitive to sugar along the outer edge of the tongue. We have salty kind of behind that, more at the tongue blade, and bitter and sour are more towards the back of the tongue. So the taste buds are kind of differentially spread around the tongue, right? So there's regions of the tongue that are most sensitive to different core flavors. By the way, you might also know that there are revisions of this kind of map where other core flavors have been considered. I think one's called umami, which is like the taste of seaweed, and there's kind of a taste of something like meat. So we might have more than just these four, but these are, you know, the most important thing to remember here is that there are different regions of the tongue that are sensitive to different sorts of core flavors. Of course, these aren't going to give you things like banana. These aren't going to give you things like raspberry. That's going to come through the nose. But things like sweet are going to come from the tongue, at least. Okay? So here's the issue. When we, just imagine having, what's your favorite hard candy? Or maybe a breath mint or something like that. I'm kind of a Tic Tac addict. I don't know why. I like those, you know, for my breath. I like the flavor, that sort of thing. And at least initially, say I take an orange Tic Tac, you know, there's a sweetness to that along with the orange, right? And as the sweetness kind of glides around my tongue, because you know, as you have a hard candy, you do put it all around your mouth. You don't just keep it on one part of your tongue. It seems like the flavor follows the candy. Okay, so let's just talk about an orange Tic Tac having a sweet flavor. You know, any sort of hard candy is going to have a sweet flavor. And when you first taste it, yeah, you do possibly put it on the front of your tongue, so your sweet taste buds are going to detect that sweetness. However, it then starts floating around your tongue and hits parts of your tongue that are not sensitive to sweets. Okay, it goes to the back of the tongue where only the bitter is what's detected, and to the side of the tongue where only sour is detected, and just right behind the kind of front edge of the tongue where salt is detected. However, regardless of where that Tic Tac lands, okay, it's going to taste sweet. This is a phenomenon known as tactile capture, and it's really interesting. It suggests that there's kind of an illusory aspect to this, you know, that you're, even though there's nothing touching the candy in the back of the tongue that can detect sweetness, it still tastes sweet to you. So hard candy, Tic Tacs, that sort of stuff are good examples of these sort of illusions. And the question is why? Why is that the case, that flavor follows a candy? Or in general, flavor follows the food around your tongue. Because, again, think about what's happening here. Even though there's no sweet receptors at the back of the tongue, when the candy hits the back of the tongue, it still seems sweet. What's going on there? Well, this is tactile capture. That the location, okay, a piece of food is felt on the tongue will determine, well, let me say this again. There's kind of you step back here a second. Okay. Yes. Once the flavor of something is established, the flavor follows the food based on where it's touching the tongue. At that point, you know, the flavor is going to follow the food to the back, to the side, to the you know, behind the kind of the tongue blade back here. Depending on where it's touched. And I got this kind of very intuitive example to talk to you about. Imagine this. So most of the sweet receptors are at the very tip of the tongue. Okay, that's what this is showing here. Right? And what happens? Okay, here's this demonstration. We used to do this in the discussion section as well. It's a little messy, but it works really well if you want to try it at home. You just take a Q-tip or something like a Q-tip and dip it in sugar water. Okay, some sort of sweet solution. I think you can even do this like with maple syrup or something like that. And what you do is you start by putting the Q-tip at the side edge of your tongue. Okay, here, here, I'll show you. Right, say here. And you start kind of gliding it around the side edge. And at that point, because there are no sweet receptors on the side of the tongue, you won't know what flavor it is. You won't say it's sweet, salty, or anything at that point. But then once you bring it around and the Q-tip touches a sweet taste bud, you're very aware, oh yes, it's a sweet solution. This is a sweet sugar water that's on the Q-tip. And then you continue to move it around the other outer edge, okay, around here. You'll say, yes, I continue to taste sweet. I guess we have sweet taste buds in the tip of the tongue and sweet taste buds around the, right side of a tongue from the viewer's perspective. Okay, there's none on the left side, but there's some in the front and there's some on the right side because I continue to taste sweet as I move the Q-tip around. Okay, cool. Okay, so you write that down. That's your first note in your lab book, right? And then you're asked to kind of rinse out your mouth to get all the sweet out of your mouth, and you dip the Q-tip back in some sweet solution. And now you say, okay, let's just confirm that you do have sweet taste buds around the right side of your tongue. So go ahead now and put your Q-tip on the right edge. Okay, and you go, that's funny, I don't taste sweet. Okay, and you continue to move it up, and then finally the Q-tip hits the taste buds that are sweet detecting in front of your tongue. You say, okay, yes, it's sweet now. Okay, now you continue to move it around to the left side of the tongue, okay, from our perspective again, and you say, yeah, now I'm tasting it continuing to be sweet around this side of the tongue. So now it would seem like this side of the tongue is the one with the taste buds. What does that mean? Does it mean that, in fact, the taste buds have jumped over or something like that? No. The truth is you neither have sweet taste buds around the left edge of the tongue or the right edge of the tongue. You do have sweet taste buds in the very tip. And once you establish the flavor of something, the flavor will follow where you're being touched, even if there's no taste buds that are designed to detect that particular flavor, sweet, where you're touching. So it's the sweet tongue illusion, right? The flavor follows where you're being touched. The flavor follows where the food is touching your tongue, even if you don't have taste buds that are designed to detect that particular flavor. Okay, so that's how tactile capture, where you're being touched on the tongue, will determine how you taste the food as it being sweet. Once it's established, it's going to follow the food. It's going to be following where you're touched on the tongue. Okay, that's the sweet tongue illusion. I'm going to skip this blind spot analogy thing. It's a tiny bit confusing, so you're not going to be responsible for this on your exam. But just for some of you that maybe have studied perceptual psychology before, you might know that there's a blind spot in the retina where the nerves leave the eye. You know, maybe you've done this demonstration before where you move a finger, you keep one eye forward, you move a finger, and all of a sudden there's a spot where the finger kind of disappears, and you keep going and the finger reappears. The reason that occurs is because the finger's image is going into the part of your retina, the back of your eye, that doesn't have detectors for a visual image. Okay, but if that's the case, you're wondering, why don't we see holes in the world where the retina can't detect any light? And the reason is because the brain kind of fills it in. And that's kind of what's going on here too with this tactile capture. The brain kind of fills in where the flavor might be, even if you don't have detectors for that particular flavor in that part of your tongue. The brain kind of helps kind of compensate for that lack of sense organs for that type of flavor, okay? So that's kind of one really fundamental example that touch is so important to our sense of flavor that where we're being touched on the tongue determines how the flavor is moving around with the food, even if we don't have receptors sensitive to that flavor. There's other ways touch can have an influence on what we taste. Okay, so for example, we talked about viscosity before, and the idea of viscosity is, I think the thing that I always think about when I consider viscosity is something like a custard or a pudding, or some sort of creamy type of dessert. And we know that if you look at a custard, we talked about this already, that the visible texture of it, how viscous it is, will have an influence on how strong the sugar content tastes to us. That's just by looking at the texture. But if you're blindfolded and a custard is put in your mouth, if it is a thicker texture that you're feeling, you can certainly feel texture with your mouth. You know, think of a thin custard, kind of watery, versus a thick custard. That is something you can feel with your mouth. You have touch receptors all through your mouth and tongue. Okay? The viscosity will have an effect on how sweet the custard is experienced. So this is something that, food designers, people that make, off-the-shelf foods, whether you're buying a pudding, whether you're buying a custard mix or something like that, they know that the more viscous, the thicker, the goopier the custard, the more flavor they have to add for it to seem flavorful, okay? So, the folks at, Pillsbury are going to make a custard, and they think that, let's make this, we'll call this homemade custards because it's going to be extra thick. And they say, well, if it's going to be extra thick, you do have to add more flavor. You have to, because people, the tongue, the brain expects a thick custard to have a stronger taste. So they will, in fact, add more sugar if it's going to be a thicker custard. They'll add more of a custard sort of aroma to it if it's going to be a thicker custard. Thinner custards, on the other hand, need less sugar. So the idea here is the brain's analysis of the texture of a food item is going to influence whether it tastes strong or weak. And these companies have to do something to offset that influence of touch texture on tasted flavor. Okay, that's another great example of this. Even more fundamental things. So touch, as you know, doesn't just determine the location of a food in your mouth. It doesn't determine just the viscosity, the kind of general texture, but your touch sense also determines temperature. And temperature has a humongous influence on how things taste. And you might know that the major reason that you might send back a food is because it's too cold. If it's too hot, you'll just wait for it to cool down because you don't want it to be painful. But if it's too cold, it's unpleasant and it doesn't taste right. And in fact, we know that's true, that there is an ideal temperature where food has its strongest, its most vivid flavor. And it turns out it's about the same temperature as your tongue. I guess that's probably, what, 98.6 or something like that, right? If you take your temperature below your tongue to find out what your body temperature is, it's about 98.6. So when chefs at, good restaurants at least, are making food, they want it to get to your plate at a point when it is a temperature most similar to your tongue, because that's when the food's going to taste best. And they do a lot, especially at fancy pants restaurants, they do a lot to ensure that it's maybe at that temperature or a little bit warmer than that, not a lot warmer. And if it's any colder than that, it's most likely going to be sent back. And in fact, that detection, that touch detection of temperature is such a strong influence that it just needs to be 2 degrees cooler than the temperature of your tongue, 98.6, so it's 96 or something like that. At that point, it won't taste good to you. And at that point, people do send it back. And so sometimes you do see, I don't know if they show this ever on the cooking shows you folks like so much, but you do see chefs use a thermometer to test the food to make sure it is close to or a little bit above whatever the tongue temperature is, 98.6, right? And the sense temperature can have other influences as well. So you can induce phantom flavors. This I thought was really interesting, so I tried it myself at home after I read about this. Water doesn't have much of a flavor, depending on the water minerality that's in your faucet, but it doesn't have much of a flavor. So certainly, though, if you freeze water or warm water, it's the same ingredient, obviously, H2O. But serving water cold and asking whether there's a salt solution or sugar solution added versus serving water warm and asking that same question will induce different responses. So you're in an experiment and you're kind of being tricked here. You're saying, okay, we're testing out the tongue sensitivity to very, very weak salty and very, very weak sugary sorts of flavors. So what we're going to do is you're going to be drinking this and telling us whether you think we added salt and sugar. The truth is nothing was added. And they first present the water cold and say, is it sugary or salty? You say, well, there's not much flavor there, but if I had to guess anything, I say salty. Say, okay, now here's another sample, and this time it will be presented warm. Now, it's the exact same water, but they don't know that. Say, okay, here's another sample. Would you say this is more sugary or salty? And if it's warmer, especially a little warmer than the tongue, they're more likely to say salty. And these are phantom flavors. These are flavors that actually don't really exist in the water, or very little of them exist in the water. But still, even if it's the exact same water, the temperature of the water will induce somebody to say that if it's colder, it will seem more salty. And if it's warmer, it will seem more sweet. And you can actually do this, if you taste an ice cube, in your water on its own, and try to introspect and say, does this taste more salty or sweet? Most people are going to say more salty. And if then you have a sip of warm water, it's going to taste sweeter, even though there's no difference. The water is the exact same chemical compound in both cases. It's the temperature that can induce these phantom flavors, which actually don't exist. Okay, they exist in the brain, they exist in the taste system, but it's just another great example of what you touch and how the brain interprets what you touch will have a direct influence on taste. And this isn't really that surprising if you look at the neurophysiology behind what's going on. As it turns out, the parts of our brain that are considered to be most receptive to flavor are filled with touch neurons. There are so many neurons that aren't just sensitive to flavor, but are also sensitive to touch in that region of the brain. It's the exact same story that you've seen with sight, hearing, and smell, right? Leading us to make this conclusion that you taste what you integrate. And in a way, out of all the senses we'll be discussing, taste seems to be the one that is most dependent on the other senses, is most affected by the other senses. So taste is the most multisensory of your senses. And all senses, as we've talked about, all senses directly influence taste. You have examples of that now from everything we've discussed. Smell, from the demonstration Serena did. Sight, you can think of going to a dark restaurant if you ever get a chance. Sound, crunching Pringles. Touch, the fact that you've got this illusion that where you're touched on your tongue determines where the flavor is, even if there's no taste buds there to detect it, right? There are direct influences on taste from all the different senses. In addition to that, there are indirect influences. And what I mean by that is one sense, like sight, will affect our sense of texture, which then will affect our sense of taste. So that's what I mean by indirect. One sense will affect another sense, and then that sense will affect our sense of taste. One great example of this is viscosity again. How a custard smells will influence how thick it seems on our tongue. You can also imagine, I'm sure this is the case, that when you look at a custard and it seems thick, if you then put it on your tongue and are asked to judge its thickness, there's going to be an influence on what you see, but also simply on what you smell. This one smells like a thicker custard. I guess this works like this. There's research on this. And because smell has an influence over our touch reception when it comes to viscosity, the viscosity, we already know this, the felt viscosity on our tongue is going to influence how sweet the custard seems. If it's more viscous, it's going to seem less sweet. Okay, you have to add more sugar to offset that. If it's less viscous, if it's more watery, it's going to seem more sweet if it's the same amount of sugar in both cases. Right? You have to offset that too, potentially, by making it with less sugar if it tastes too sweet. Okay. Also, the texture of a food can influence perceived temperature, which then, of course, we know will affect taste. And this is, I think, becomes most relevant to that story. And if you've gone through the book, I used to be able to find time in the lectures to talk about this. I don't anymore. But one of my favorite interviews, I have so many, was with what's called a sense specialist, which is really a taste specialist that is hired by companies to taste food to determine that there's some consistency between how things taste across years or something like that. So, for example, fig Newtons is the example this person gave me. You taste so there's different. They put real figs in fig Newtons, and different years will have different crops of figs, and some years will be sweeter figs than others, and so they have to make sure that there's the same sweetness from year to year. You don't want your fig Newton to taste very different from last year's fig Newton, right? And so they bring in specialists that will really be able to concentrate on the individual ingredients in anything they eat. And they're trained to do so. And it's a really interesting process by which they're trained. And other examples, they'll be asked to determine whether they can taste an oil going bad. So these are the folks that kind of help determine the best by statements that are stamped on your bag of potato chips. So you buy a bag of potato chips. It says it's best to eat them by August 20th, 2021 or something like that, right? These are the folks that help establish that, because they can actually anticipate by tasting a potato chip when they will taste less good, by being able to note things like when the oil is beginning to turn a little bit, the oil of potato chips. So these folks are amazing, and it was really fun to talk to one of them and get the details of not only what their training is like and how they kind of teach other people to do this, but what their own experience of eating food is like just outside of the laboratory. It's a great story if you get a chance to read it. But one of the things that really matters in these sorts of lab tests, and usually they're in big companies, Keebler does it and Nabisco does it and all this sort of stuff. It's critical that the temperature of the cookies that they are in fact giving them are absolutely the same. Okay, So, and the size of the pieces have to be the same because of things like temperature affecting how texture, and the other way around, texture can affect how perceived temperature of a food item is experienced. And as we know, temperature can have a very strong influence on how flavorful something seems to us. So, this is such an amazing kind of set of influences from all the different senses that are occurring on your sense of flavor. We think of flavor as a tongue sort of experience. You taste food on your tongue, and yeah, I mean that's the way it is. But it is such an illusion because you're tasting food with your eyes, your ears, your skin, and your nose all the time, and relatively little of our sense of flavor actually is provided by the tongue, which is pretty interesting, even though that's where we experience flavor. So the idea here is that taste is in some ways the most multi-sensory of all your senses. Okay, good place to take a little break and see if there's questions and do a practice question. Looks like there's a question. Let me just fiddle around here. Cool. Yes. Oh, thank you, Ralph. Ralph is reminding us umami is a savory taste mainly found in soups, if I recall, and it's the most recent type of taste that was discovered. Yes, absolutely. I believe the most recent. I remember hearing something about another flavor having to do with meat, but it's been a long time since I followed that specific literature. I'm actually most interested in kind of the multisensory aspects of this, but thank you so much. Do you remember, Ralph, where the umami taste buds are thought to reside? Is there a concentration at the back of the tongue or the side of the tongue? Because, as we know of taste buds, they are kind of, the different parts of the tongue get different concentrations of those taste buds. Okay, Ralph. Middle. Okay, thank you, Ralph. Ralph says our little umami taste buds are in the middle. Okay, Aya asks, when chips have the best, yeah, okay, that's a great question. People ask this question a lot. Thank you for asking. So when chips have the label best by date, is that the expiration date? And the answer is no, especially for something with chips, like chips. It's not like there's an expiration date where you're going to get sick after you eat them. I mean, I guess maybe decades, maybe they would get moldy or something. I don't know. No, this is when they're most flavorful. And I think I've experienced this before. Have you ever, kind of had an old bag of chips laying around in a cupboard that you happen to find saying, oh, this is perfect. I needed a snack and I forgot I had this bag of chips, and you start eating them. It's like, these don't have a lot of flavor, or these kind of taste a little, off or something like that. It's not going to get you sick, but that's probably past the best by date. You look at the bag and say, oh my gosh, these were best by last year. I'm not surprised these don't taste good. Even things like Diet Coke, I know, can lose their flavor. So yeah, in most of these cases, it's just, if you want the best flavor, then do it by then. What I think is so interesting about this, though, is that they can use professional tasters, people who have refined their sense of taste through practice, through training, to anticipate when these dates will come. The one of the things that the taste specialist that I interviewed does most often for companies is taste, fat, junk food or cookies, crackers, that sort of stuff, and tell the companies, okay, this oil tastes like it will start being less flavorful or start, tasting a little off in 6 months from now or in a year from now. So she can, for whatever reason, determine when the chemicals will change enough to be detectable by the human tongue. And it's just amazing she's learned how to do this. Very cool. Other questions about this? Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. Thank you for the questions. Let's do a polling question then. Okay, and let's see, what do we have? I don't think we did. Did we do one on flavor appearance or food appearance last time? I don't think we did. You can let me know. Alert me if we did this already. But here's the question: which aspect of a food's appearance influences how it tastes? A, the color; B, the color intensity; C, texture; D, all the above. I didn't do that, I don't think. Let's do that one. Okay, here you go. Should be pretty easy if you've been following along in our lectures. Great, most people are getting this. And I'll just give you another 15 seconds or so. All right. Great. Okay, most of you got it. It might just be a little tricky if you weren't at last class, but I think most of you did get this. I will share the results. Take a picture of it, please. So which aspects of a food's appearance influences how it tastes? Yes, a lot. So the most common mistake was texture, and we did mention texture today, just a few seconds ago, in fact. However, as we discussed in the last class, color and color intensity does make a difference, and we talked about those characteristics when we were discussing, adding color to beverages. So you can take an orange flavored drink, color it red, and people will say it tastes like cherry, and vice versa. And then this kind of idea that the intensity of a color will influence how strong that flavor seems. So both color and color intensity are things that do influence taste as well as texture, as we've just been mentioning. So the correct answer is D. Okay, let me know if there's any question on that. And if not, we'll continue talking about taste. All right, great. We are getting to one of my favorite discussions of the whole class, and that is the discussion of master sommeliers. My French ain't good. But there's Steve Poe. Now, so what's a master sommelier? All right, so you might know what a sommelier, I'm sorry for my French, but it's a French word. It's the person at a restaurant who recommends wine, depending on what your mood is, what type of wine you want to drink, a red or white, a rosé, whatever, and the type of food you have. So you might be a little young to have gone to a restaurant that has an active sommelier. I haven't been to many, that's for sure, but I think it's interesting. Maybe 2 or 3 in my life, I've had a sommelier come up. These are people who, choose the wine for the restaurants, and the ones that kind of stock the wine cellar. And they are the ones that will recommend wines. Often, waiters do this, but if it's a fancy restaurant that's known for its wine collection, they will have a special person there that walks around and helps people choose wine. And so that's what a sommelier does. And then they're the ones that also will come over and open the bottle of wine after you've chosen it, and let you sniff the wine. It's kind of it's kind of a gimmicky sort of thing for a lot of us, but for serious wine drinkers, and I don't know, maybe some of you or some of your family are serious wine drinkers, it's kind of fun. It's it's kind of a fun hobby for them. I have friends that are fairly serious wine drinkers, and I used to go to parties where it'd be like a group of, I hate to say this, but wine nerds, where they would try to trick each other about what type of wines they were serving them. So there'd be wines, kind of covered in paper bags, and they pour them for each other and try to fool each other into thinking it's one type of wine where it's actually another. Ooh, what a fun party. I'm more of a beer drinker, so I didn't do much of this. But, when you think about that sort of thing, you think about there's kind of a nerdy aspect to it. And the thing about Stephen Poe, and I'm glad he was the one I talked to, the sommelier I talked to, because he doesn't feel like that. He feels like he really does not like wine snobbery whatsoever. He just feels that he loves wine and he wants to share his passion with other people. He wants to share his hobby with other people. Just like if you're a big fan of a type of music or, a type of a TV show or something, you want to let people know about it. That's the way he is. And he's not going to put people down for not knowing about it. He wants people to feel comfortable to learn about it, which was great because he wasn't just a sommelier. He was a master sommelier. He's one of the guys in the world, guys and gals in the world, that teaches other sommeliers how to talk about wine, how to taste wine, how to present wine. It's very hard to achieve master sommelier status. In fact, when I just looked this up, there's still less than 300 in the entire world that actually qualify for master sommelier status. It is not an easy thing to do. These are people that are very, very into wine. People like Steve Poe aren't snobby about it. He has a history as a football player in college. He was a Marine. He's kind of a down-to-earth guy in a lot of ways. He just wants to share his passion. But man, is it a passion for these folks. They love talking about wine. They love sharing what they know about wine. And it's hard to become one of these folks. You're trained in France or England, and then you need to go through a very rigorous set of 3 exams. The first 2 exams aren't terrible. If you're good at studying, you don't do awful on these exams, especially, the wine theory exam. That's where it's a paper and pencil exam where they have to, I don't know if it's multiple choice or short answer or essay, but they have to discuss different theories of why wines from different regions taste different and how different production techniques will influence wines. They have to kind of provide their book knowledge, their studying knowledge on that exam. The second exam is serving decorum, so they have to go through like kind of they have to present wine to some of the judges as if they would be doing it in a restaurant. They also have to learn about other things like cigars and stuff like that a little bit, and how to prepare a cigar and all this sort of stuff. But he says most people pass that on their first or second try. The one that takes forever is the blind tasting. And this is the one I was most interested in. And the blind tasting is exactly how it sounds. What they do is they have to sit there in front of 6 glasses of wine that are all, the same type, all reds, for example, and taste them and determine detailed things about them. So they can be anywhere in the world, and they have to not just say, oh, this is a red, this is a Zinfandel, this is a Chardonnay or something like that. They don't do that. They have to do that, but they also have to identify the grape variety, the region the grapes were grown in, and the vintage, what year, the grapes were grown in. And if they can, then say the vineyard, or maybe one of the vineyards that the company that actually made the wine. And they have to do that from any wine in the world, whether it's from Napa Valley, Australia, Italy, France. Any wine in the world could be put in front of them, and they have to say where it's from and when it was made, and the very specific region, if not the actual vineyard. It is really, really, really hard. And they do this, I should mention, in front of a group of judges, and that can be intimidating. And the group of judges are master sommeliers. And it's important as they're doing this that they are able to give their reasoning behind why they think any one of these wines is, Zinfandel from the Tuscany region, probably this vineyard, and bottled in 1978. They have to give their logic for this, all right? And they're rated on their accuracy, their reasoning, and their description. And people need to take this 3 or 4 times. I think Steve said he needed to take it 3 different times, and they have to have a year between each time. They can't just take it the next week or something like that. They have to go back and study and come back and take it again. And it takes people 3 or 4 times. Some people never pass. And that's why there's only 269 in the world. It's amazing. You know what? I actually have a quote here. It's judged by 3 masters. I have a quote that's going to kind of give you a general sense. But before I do that, let me actually show you a little video of somebody practicing for this. I hope it looks okay. If it doesn't, it should sound okay. Hold on. There he is. It should sound okay to give you an idea of how he's doing this. So he's just practicing. As you can see, he's not dressed up. He's just doing this with his friends. I don't know who this is, but this does a recording. And he's got, looks like he's got some white wines in front of him, maybe.
Cheese rind. Lots of honey. The wine is off dry. Medium intensity. Medium body. Fragrant wine, acidity is high. Tannin low. Alcohol, medium. Fruits have changed a little bit on the palate. I'm getting some apricot, peach notes, a little stone fruit, along with the lemon lime. And that Meyer lemon is converted into key lime. Quality is medium. Final conclusion with the Chenin, Browns, Loire. With this at Vouvray, Demi, Sec, and Vintage in 2009. One number 3 is wine.
And in this example, he's absolutely correct, which is pretty amazing. Even the year. So let me go ahead and give you this little description. This is taken right from the book, but I think it's just a really kind of interesting, provides interesting insight into how he's doing this. This is Steve Poe now. During his, I think he said this was part of the exam that he actually passed. I remember that I was working to identify the last of my 6 wines. Time was running out. I had looked at the wine's legs, and the wine's legs are, how I should have brought wine into the lecture today so we can do this better. The wine's legs are, we swirl it around the glass. It doesn't happen with fizzy water like this one is, but when you swirl it around the glass, it kind of sticks to the glass a little bit and it kind of drips down. Those are the wine's legs. I inhaled its bouquet. Here, I'll pretend. I inhaled its bouquet, and then I took a sip, and I was trying to describe it as if it were an overripe Cabernet Syrah blend, probably from Australia. Okay, they kind of lost me there. I'm not sure I would ever be able to tell if something was a Cabernet or Syrah. Certainly, I would not be able to tell it was from Australia. But something just didn't seem right. I thought again about its characteristics. It was a little off-dry. I can kind of guess what that would be. It was big. I guess that means it had a lot of flavor to it. It had high alcohol. And I might be able to determine that. I'm not sure. It had a spiciness, and it had a little of dried raisins. When they get into things like, Meyer lemon and raisins, I don't think I would be able to taste that easily. Maybe if somebody trained me, I'd be able to start detecting those sort of things. And then it just clicks, said Steve Poe. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's an Amarone, which is a red wine from Veneto, Italy. It was just one of those situations where the studying and the focus just took over. And I think that's such a useful description that he provided, because what he's doing here is he's making a connection between his experience studying how wines are made, the production techniques of wine, the type of grape that's used, the type of soil that's used in particular regions and how that soil is native to that region, and the type of weather different regions have, whether they have a very wet season or dry season. That's going to have an influence over the soil and therefore the grape that is going to show up in the flavor. So he studies, he reads and sips, and reads and sips. And, he said he had to do this for years to learn how flavors were associated with different types of wines. And, sometimes these things are very subtle, like maybe the difference between 2 wines that are actually from completely different parts of the world differ in the degree of Meyer lemon or the degree of raisin they have in it. but he has to learn to detect that sort of thing. And then hopefully he'll realize that, oh, this combination of other flavors plus raisin means it's a Amarone or something like that. I just love this example because it's an example of perceptual expertise that's being informed by explicit learning, right? And so this is kind of important for me. So it's got to be important for you. That most of what we've talked about with perceptual expertise, whether it's Daniel Kish, riding his bike and echolocating, the folks that do sound engineering and can be able to hear very subtle differences in reflected sound, other examples of experts in smell and hearing, the beep baseballs, that sort of thing. Those examples all involve just basically practice and some training where certain things were maybe attended to more than others or something like that. But here's this kind of unique, or maybe not unique, but our first example of actual explicit book learning, reading things, informing a sensory experience. And I just think this is so cool. That the way to become a wine expert like, Steve Poe isn't just to keep drinking wine, it's learning about how your flavor experience is influenced by, things that the vineyard's doing in its production, things that are happening to the grape as it's being grown, things that are happening to the soil as it's, a very wet season. I think that's really cool. And it is consistent with the research that's been done on these folks. Out of all the expertise that we're talking about, the research on wine experts is one of the most full literatures, okay? So there's a lot more research on wine experts than there are on expert echolocators or, expert, smellers, people that sniff perfume or scent designers, like the folks that do it for environmental, context lobbies. There's a lot more research on wine experts for some reason. And it's nice because I think it's consistent with what Steve Poe's own experience is like. Because, when these folks are tested, what you find is they actually don't taste wine with their tongue more, their tongues themselves, I should say, their thresholds for tasting a flavor are no better than the rest of us. Okay, they're no better than the rest of us. In other words, you could say, have a glass of water and put a tiny little eyedropper of wine in it. And the question would be, how much of that tiny little eyedropper of wine is needed for Steve Poe to taste wine in the water versus Rosenblum to taste wine in the water? And guess what? Is equally sensitive to there being wine there. They're not more able to taste that a wine is present in a glass of water. So it's not like their tongue is more sensitive at all. And it's the same thing with discriminative ability, okay? So, say you put two wines in front of me and my job is to say whether they're the same or different. I would be as good at that as Steve Poe. Now, he, might then be able to tell you what the wines are and all these details about the wines. And I would be like, they just taste a little different to me, Steve. I'm not going to have the ability to kind of elaborate on that, but I'll say, hey, I knew these were different. I'm no dummy, right? But that's something that comes without any practice at all. So the discriminative abilities aren't different between Steve Poe and myself. It's also, by the way, true of wine smells, and this is kind of an interesting little aside, I think. You can, to tell, rather than now drinking them, I have to tell whether the wines are the same or different just by smelling. And I would be as good at that as Steve Poe. We all would be, okay? And in fact, one thing you can do when it comes to smelling wine is you can fool somebody into thinking that they're smelling a red wine, even though it's a white wine, if in fact you put you put food coloring into a white wine to make it red. So this is a great thing to do. Like, you have only white wine at home, and some of your wine drinking friends are coming, and you don't have time to go to the store. So they only like red wine. Quick, go to the cupboard, get some red food coloring out, and drop it, into the bottles. Pour it into the bottles because they're going to think it's red wine, at least in terms of the smell. And it's also that little trick not only fools, people that aren't experts, it would also fool Steve Poe to some degree. This wine color illusion. It would affect his sense of smell, I should say. I'm not sure he would not be able to tell you were tricking him by tasting it and spending some time with it. But I asked him about this, and I said, could you imagine that I would be able to fool you by putting red food coloring in a white wine and having you smell it? Would it then smell like a red wine to you? He goes, yeah, I could imagine that happening. I'm not sure if I tasted it, whether it would fool me, but smelling it, yeah, I bet it would, because when we experience wine as experts, okay, we look at it for a long time, even before we smell it. We look at its color. We hold it up to the light. We look, to see how the light kind of is seen through it, kind of the opacity of the wine, all that sort of stuff. We look at its legs, as we discussed before. And I can imagine that would have an influence on how the wine smelled to me. I imagine I could be fooled like that, said Steve Poe, which was interesting. Okay. So what you should get from this is that it's not like their tongues are more sensitive to wine. Their thresholds are the same. Their ability to discriminate wines, same, different, or the same. They also could fall prey to this sort of illusion when it comes to the smell of wine. However, if you then put them in a scanning machine, a brain scanning machine, these magnetic resonance imaging machines, things look very different in Steve Poe's brain. Things look very different. This is where it kind of gets interesting. So what you do, I can imagine of all the experiments that you could be a participant in while having your brain scanned, this is probably one of the more pleasant. They have you in an MRI scanner. I assume you folks know a little bit about what that's about. It's just a way of scanning the brain. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, I think, is what we're talking about here. So it's fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Don't worry about the technology. Just know it's a way of looking at the brain as the brain's processing experience. Okay, and you get to sip wine, and your brain is scanned to see how the brain's reacting to the sipped wine. And Steve Poe is put into the scanner. His brain is scanned as he's sipping wine. In fact, there you do start to see differences. You start to see differences in, for example, the parts of Steve Poe's brain where smell and taste are thought to converge. Okay, so his sense of smell might have, for whatever reason, a greater or maybe a more efficient influence over his taste experience based on at least this imaging sort of measure than other folks would. All right, so he has enhanced smell taste convergence in his Steve Poe part of the brain. All right, what else? This I think is really interesting. You might know something about the differences in what's called laterality, or the difference in the two sides of the brain. Does that sound familiar to you folks, that the left side of the brain does one thing, the right side of the brain does something else? Well, it's not so clear-cut as you would read in the popular press, but it looks like that some processes are more, I guess, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for, more efficient in one side of the brain than the other. You might know that your analytic processes are more of a left brain sort of thing, where your spatial ability is more of a right brain sort of thing. This, by the way, is true of right-handed folks. Most of what I'll be talking about when it comes to the sides of the brain are true of right-handed folks. Things are different from left-handed and truly ambidextrous people. But for right-handed people, the left side of the brain is considered to be more analytical. And for Steve Poe, that side of the brain, when he sips wine, lights up like crazy. Steve Poe versus Rosenblum will show a lot more left hemisphere, left side of the brain activity when he sips wine than when I sip wine, suggesting that almost immediately when he sips wine, his brain becomes more analytical about the experience. His left brain, having to do with analysis and maybe language and that sort of stuff, his left side of his brain, is going to be more analytical, and it's going to happen spontaneously. And so that kind of starts to become consistent with Steve Poe's own experience of what's going on, right? He's saying, I think my book learning is helping me. I think the explicit learning I'm doing by, reading and remembering different sorts of production techniques that happen in France versus Italy, that those sorts of things that I'm learning have an influence over what happens when I sip wine. And the brain imaging research is consistent with that. Greater left hemisphere activity for Steve Poe, probably related to the analytical processes that naturally occur while he's sipping wine. Okay. And it's also seems to be the case that when he's sipping wine, it's not just the left hemisphere, but areas in the left hemisphere and some in the right that are known to be involved in memory and the language particularly get activated when he's sipping wine. He shows greater activity in regions that have to do with memory in his brain than I do when I sip wine. When he sips wine, he activates more language areas than I do when I sip wine. All consistent with his own kind of introspective experience, which is great. I think it's so cool. So it's not that wine experts like Steve Poe, are kind of have a low-level ability to detect wine. That there's a wine in this glass of water now. I'm as good at that as he is. Even when it comes to determining whether two wines are the same or different, I'm as good as him. It's not that kind of very low-level discriminative ability that distinguishes us. What distinguishes us is that he has a sophisticated conceptual understanding. He has a kind of ideas of how things work, and a language that allows this to work, that then inform his experience of flavor. It's a much more kind of explicit way of becoming a perceptual expert than we've seen before, which I think is really, really interesting. Okay. I guess this is maybe not a bad place to take a little break. Yeah, let's take a little break here and do see if there's questions, and then we'll do a polling question. So looks like there is one question. Oh, okay. So Nassim said, I am great on that. So Nassim, are you referring to wine, or are you referring to determining something like when a food's expiration date is? Could you let us know that? That's an interesting, either one's very interesting. What are you good at, Nassim, when it comes to tasting? I'm very curious. I'll let him respond or her respond. Give him a chance. Any other questions, though, about wine tasting or about Steve Poe or anything that we're discussing now? Again, oh, yes.
Yeah, I'm good in wine, but my professional is whiskey and bourbon.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, do you think you can do these things by taste, Nassim?
No. Those professional, no, but I can tell you different, which kind of wine. It's like, but years and places very hard. But okay. I can tell you which brand of wine.
Which brand of wine?
Which brand of wine? It's like it's like Shiraz.
Yeah.
Or
Gotcha. Yeah. Which style? Right. I absolutely understand. That's great. And did you do most of this just out of practice and trying?
Practice.
Yeah.
It's one winery is very close to my home. They had the classes used to before the coronavirus. So sometime I went there. They give you the how to test it, what the difference between the tested. Yeah. But the bourbons and whiskey and rye, I did them. I did them by myself, study, and I have a big collection of whiskey and bourbons in my home.
That's very interesting. That's great. Yeah, no, it's an interesting hobby to have, I think, because you're realizing that, kind of the more you experience it, the more you understand it and the more you appreciate it. And I'm sure you can taste, constellations of flavors that you probably didn't notice when you were first trying to, you know, taste bourbons and wines and things like that. You know, really can kind of notice yourself become better at it with experience. Yeah.
Yes, also it's like 20 years of experience.
Yeah.
Is not coming by one day. And you know, if you give me like vodka, I don't, I'm testing same, all of them same. But if you get to the bourbon, especially bourbon and the whiskey, they have a different flour. How long do they put them in that barrels? Which origin are coming from? All of them is totally different, and it's amazing. Like you think like which kind of flour they add to them. It's the taste totally different.
Wow. Oh, that is so cool. Thank you for sharing that. That is fascinating. I just think, I mean, you know, I'm a bit of a beer drinker, but I don't know if I could really recognize brands of beer. Well, maybe there are some I could. I can probably tell like stouts from porters, from you know, ambers and things like that without looking. And I know I've gotten pickier over the time, and I guess if there's a downside to this, sometimes it ends up being a little bit more expensive as you go on, but you do enjoy it more. So I absolutely understand the experience. Yeah, that's very cool. Thank you for sharing with that. Other questions, other comments on this sort of thing? Anyone have anything else like this? Doesn't have to be with any sort of, you know, drink or alcohol or anything like that. Anyone have an experience with I don't know, desserts, ice creams, anything like that? Very curious. I find this so kind of interesting because it doesn't come intuitive to me that, you know, people could actually improve their sense of taste so greatly like Stephen Poe or like Nassim. I think it's very, very interesting. Okay, that's fine. Let's just do a quick polling question, and then we'll take a break. Now let's do this one. Actually, let me do it. We're going to talk about, this is a little tricky from some people sometimes. So this is the one with the hard candy idea. So the fact that the candy actually the flavor follows the candy. So the question is this: why does a hard candy taste sweet wherever it is located in your mouth? Okay, A, you have sweet taste buds all over your mouth. That's answer A. B, your taste buds move around to follow the candy. Your actual physical taste buds move around to follow the candy. C, tactile capture makes it seem like the sweet flavor is located wherever the candy touches your mouth. Or D, none of the above. Let's see how we do on this one. Okay, it's about 30 seconds. So far, so good. And I'll just give you another 10 seconds here, and then we'll go ahead and explain it. Okay, terrific. I will share with you. And again, don't worry if you didn't get this right. Again, this has no bearing on your grade. It's all anonymous. But it will be on your test. So here you go. Here's a test question you will get right because the correct answer is, in fact, C. It was a little tricky, though, because this is a trickier concept than other things we've talked about. So what happens is, first of all, your taste buds do not move around, and they are differentially spread across your tongue. What that means is that you have sweet taste buds generally towards the front of your tongue, salty ones behind them, and bitter and sour way in back. So you don't have sweet taste buds all around your tongue, so that's not going to help you much. So what seems to occur is this concept of tactile capture, because where the food is touching your tongue is going to determine where the flavor seems to come from. It is like an illusion. So the correct answer is C. Tactile capture makes it seem like the sweet flavor is located wherever the candy touches your mouth. So that's a really strong touch influence on flavor in this case. So C is the correct answer. None of the above is incorrect as well. Okay, terrific. Take a picture if you haven't yet. And it's great. Are there any last minute questions or should we take our break? All right, let's take our break here and come back in 10 minutes. Okay, everybody, we're back. And hey, look, I'm Yoda. Or Baby Yoda? I don't know. Something's going on in my head, though. But I think this does make me look wiser, right? Which is a good thing because we do have our test coming up. Happy to answer any questions about the test that folks may have before we continue on our material for today. Anything? All right, no problem. We can just continue. Let me get rid of this silliness. Yeah, put me on a spaceship. Oh, here we go. You can see a little of the background of my real environment. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and continue on this. And as I said, I think this is a really interesting sort of story here. The idea that we can use explicit learning to improve our sense of flavor in this case. And I think it's worth it for us to kind of go back and see now that we've learned a little bit about the conceptual basis of this. We should go back and look at Stephen Poe's experience again, his kind of own insights into this. I think it's really useful for that. So let's do that. The idea here is, as I've been saying again and again, it's in Steve Poe's case and Wine Expert's case, explicit knowledge helps attention to the meaningful constellations of flavors. And he used this word a lot, constellation, as it pertains to flavor. He said that, what he's looking for, he's able to taste individual things and, kind of being analytical about it. Tasting one group of things will allow him to attend to another group of things. So as you saw the individual in that video go through his experience, you could see like he started to name flavors, and as he was naming flavors, that would bring him to a conclusion about the wine, like where it was from, what year it was from, that sort of thing. But the idea that kind of being able to recognize some flavors and how then one's knowledge can tell you about how to attend to other flavors to see if they are there is really, really helpful. And the example he gave was something called malolactic fermentation. And what malolactic fermentation is I guess it's a form of secondary fermentation. So, to get the wine to be have alcohol in it, it goes through a fermentation process. But malolactic fermentation is a second one that the wine goes through. And I don't know if it adds very much alcohol, the second one, but it's really mostly to add a certain flavor. And there are certain types of wine styles that incorporate the technique in order to give that style the sort of flavors that the technique allows. So what malolactic fermentation will do, it will make a wine have a buttery texture. These are terms that Steve Poe used. A sauerkraut kind of flavor and a yogurt flavor. Now, I think this would go beyond my at least initial experience of wine. I imagine maybe if it was buttery in the sense that it seems smooth on the tongue, maybe that's buttery, but sauerkraut, can't imagine myself ever having an experience of sauerkraut in a wine or yogurt in a wine. I'd have to really, really practice to be able to pull those things out. But folks like Steve Poe have this practice and they're able to do that. And so the idea here is by being able to detect these flavors or any one of these flavors, like yogurt, for example, they can then sip again and see, boy, I tasted yogurt in the last sip. Let's see if it's got these other characteristics, buttery and sauerkraut. And they can taste for that on the next sip and say, oh yeah, they're all there. That means this wine went through malolactic fermentation, which means it narrows down the wine I'm sipping to these, 3 styles across these 5 regions across, say France or something like that. And this, he says, is the basis for the superior recognition performance that he has, because they absolutely do this. I mean, there's no question, much more than I could do this as a non-wine drinker. Really, they can tell you whether they have sipped a wine. So in these experiments, it'll be something very simple. Well, there'll be a group of 5 wines, and you'll be asked to sip each of these. And then later on, say after you have a cracker or or swish your mouth out with water, you'll be given another 5 wines, or 10 wines. You're asked to say which of these 10 wines were the 5 wines that you just had a sip of. And that would be very difficult for me. It might not be difficult for some people though, and it would not be difficult at all for Steve Poe. He would have no problem saying, "Oh yeah, it's this one, this one, this one, and this one, this one." He would have no problem saying that whatsoever. They have a superior ability to recognize a wine that they just sipped without a problem. And the other thing they can absolutely do is they can be more systematic in how they say wines taste similar. So for example, now I'm given, so the idea is that they have more systematic similarity ratings. I'm given now, I don't know, 15 wines, and I'm asked to sip these and say which of the wines are most similar. And I would say, okay, I'm going to group these glasses here together and these glasses here together. And boy, these two are like each other, but they are so different from these that are over here. I'm going to put them kind of far away on the table. And I might be able to do this to some degree. I might feel fairly comfortable with it. But it would not necessarily be based on anything to do with the wines themselves. The style of the wine, whether it was a Zinfandel or what a rosé or whatever. They might not have anything to do with that. And in fact, if I were to come back the next day and try to do the exact same task, I might be very different in how I group the wines. But man, someone like Steve Poe could come in here and take those sips, those 15 wines, and say, okay, these are here, these are Zinfandels, these are here, these are Chardonnays, these are here, all that sort of thing, and give a reason why they're grouped, and then come back the next day and do it exactly the same way. So they are clearly superior in recognition and clearly superior in how they would rate similarities between wines. And that's very intuitive, I think, right? I can imagine them being very good at that. And the way they're able to do it, says Steve Poe, is through, again, the explicit knowledge he has of what malolactic fermentation is, as an example, and how that then allows him to taste a wine again and determine the details. Okay, so this is one of my favorite quotes from him. I think this is just terrific. I'll read it for you. There's no question that the more knowledge you have, the more tasting is informed. So there's the big take home here, that his sense of taste, his sense of flavor is informed by the knowledge he has retained from studying. If you know, for example, that they use a tufa subsoil in Anjou-Saumur in France, okay, I guess that's a region in France where they grow their grapes using a tufa subsoil, then when you're trying a Cabernet and getting that chalky sort of stony minerality of the wine, you can become confident that you're tasting a Cabernet Franc from the Loire Valley, probably Chinois. I guess that's how that's pronounced. And knowing this then can draw your attention to other tastes associated with that region. So that's the idea. You taste certain things, and then you sip again, and you taste certain things, make a guess about what else you might be able to taste when you sip it again, and it either supports your idea or it doesn't, and so you have to go on to another idea. Start with let's go back to malolactic fermentation. I think it's a little bit more intuitive for us. Again, you take a sip, there's the sauerkraut. Okay, that could mean a lot of things, but given the other things that I think about this wine, let me sip again and see if that yogurt and buttery texture are there. Take a second sip of the exact same wine and say, oh yeah, they are there. I bet this is a wine that went through malolactic fermentation, and then you can narrow it down. The same thing with his chalky, stony minerality. He could take a sip after he tastes chalky, see that, yeah, there's a minerality that I guess is a stony minerality. And then start making guesses about where the wine is from. And since he knows a lot about how a wine should taste based on where it's from, go ahead and try to confirm his guesses, confirm his hypotheses about what the wine is. And that's exactly how it's done. It's exactly what allowed him to pass his blind tasting test and become a master sommelier. It's just such a great example of perceptual expertise. I think it's so interesting. Okay, there's one other thing I want to kind of talk about in this context, a more general discussion that goes beyond wine tasting, and it really addresses perceptual expertise in general. The idea that the more you understand, the more you can perceive, okay? So again, the idea here is explicit knowledge is enhancing perception. For wine tasters, it's obviously enhancing the perception of flavor, okay? But we see these sort of examples in other contexts as well, not just for taste, but for visual perception and for auditory perception and things like that. So one of the classic examples of this is with chess players, and this is another very well studied type of perceptual expertise. So, certainly chess playing involves a lot more of our brain than just perception. It involves problem solving and memory and cognition and things like that. But the perceptual aspects of this have been studied in a lot of detail. And here's how it works. Chess players, expert chess players, are very good at taking a quick glance at a chessboard and being able to perceive it and have it in memory immediately. So you can go online and see these expert chess players. Sometimes they're kids, which makes it even that much more impressive, where they're actually playing, 10 games at the same time. Right? So they're, say, in the middle, they're in a room in the middle of 3 tables where there are 10 people playing chess, okay, against one person who's in the middle of the table. And it's an expert, so it's challenging. But it's challenging for the expert, but they're able to do it in what's seemingly a miraculous sort of way. They'll go up to each board sometimes and make their move against that individual player. But sometimes they won't even have to do that. They'll go ahead and make a move, say, with this player over here, okay? And right after they do that, say, oh, by the way, Bill, my next move, if you don't mind moving my piece, is to take my pawn and move it to Queen's 3 or something like that, which is indicating where now Bill is going to move the piece of the expert, because that's going to count in his move. And so when they do this sort of thing, when they're playing against 10, 15 different people all at the same time, what they're able to do is memorize the configuration of the pieces on the board and to do it really quickly and really accurately, okay? And there's lots of examples. This has been shown in the laboratory. You showed different chessboards to people, pictures of chessboards to people who are chess experts, and they can very easily reconstruct the board. They can say whether it's the exact same configuration they saw before. And you can look at that chessboard you're seeing there on the slide. Chessboard configurations can be very complex. Experts can do it, but only if the configuration of the pieces is such that it was based on the rules of chess. Only if the pieces, in other words, are in game positions. This is important. Expert players can't remember the configuration of pieces on a board if the pieces are randomly placed there. Okay? So if everything's mixed up and the places didn't get to their positions based on the rules of chess. The pieces all needed to follow the rules of chess to get to those positions for this expert to have this enhanced memory, right? So basically what they're doing is they're using kind of some sort of technique, some sort of memory techniques to memorize the configuration of pieces on the board that are based on the rules of chess. If the pieces are on the board in ways that deviate from the rules of chess, they're as bad as anybody else at trying to remember the configuration of the pieces. So the expert then, in this case, like in Steve Poe's case, takes their explicit knowledge about the domain that they're experts in and apply it to allow them to have this kind of enhanced perceptual skills. Very cool. Not just true of expert chess players, also true of other sorts of perceptual experts that kind of really straddle a wide domain of expertise. So you find these same sort of enhancements with coaches, with musicians, and circuit designers. I can talk a little bit about each of these. Coaches, for example, football coaches that are, have years and years of experience of kind of diagramming out plays of where the different players should go during any single play and what they're allowed, how that's going to potentially, kind of trick the other team's defense or something like that. Also true of basketball and soccer coaches and stuff like that. They have this uncanny ability to remember the locations of players on a playing field, much better than any of us non-coach folks would be doing that. But it only is an advantage if, in fact, the players are in positions that the rules of the game allow. Okay, same thing as chess. Musicians, for example, especially for those that are familiar with classical music, there are certain rules, say in Baroque music or Renaissance music, that the composer must follow when they're composing the music. Rules about what notes can go with what notes can follow other notes, all this sort of stuff. It's kind of, no reason you have to know the details of that. But, folks that are very familiar with Baroque music can look at a score of a piece and then immediately sit down and write out that same score. They have a great memory for very quickly looking at that piece and then reproducing it. But only if the piece follows the rules of Baroque music. The same with circuit designers. Again, I'm always so impressed with the wide range of expertise you see in this sort of visual perception. And it's the same deal. Circuit designers are great at looking at a circuit design, like a blueprint of a circuit design, and reproducing it or saying whether it's the same or different from the one they saw 10 minutes ago, but only if the circuit is designed based on how circuits can be designed, of the rules of electricity and all that sort of stuff. So they're using their explicit knowledge of rules to allow them to enhance, in this case, their visual perception memory. Whether we're talking about chess pieces, coaches in soccer, musicians looking at a piece of music, or circuit designers. It's all the same thing. And it's very much similar, as we've been saying, to what Steve Poe is going through when he is applying his explicit expertise, his explicit knowledge, to his experience with, say, remembering something about wines, or being able to taste the constellations of wine, flavors in wines. So, for example, and this has been studied in the laboratory, wine experts are really great at remembering word pairs. Say word pairs that pertain to wine. So asked, they say they're just, this is a very simple experiment. It's not going to involve drinking wine, tasting wine, or anything like that. They just are, Steve Poe is going to say, sit in front of a computer screen and see pairs of words come up, say 100 pairs of words come up, and then later on be asked whether those words were words he saw before or not, these pairs of words. The pairs of words are going to be descriptors that are typically applied to wines, and they will be paired sometimes so they are meaningful. So full-bodied and prune are both flavors that can be, I guess, applied to a certain style of wine. Full-bodied and lime are not flavors that typically go together to describe a wine. Steve Poe's enhancement of memorizing these pairs is only going to work if the pairs of words should go together based on how they would go together in a real wine. So he will be able to say very easily whether he had seen before the pair full-bodied and prune, okay? Much better than you and I could. But if the pair that he got was full-bodied and lime, which are not flavors that go together in any natural wine, those are, one's a white wine thing, I think lime's white wine, full-body's red wine, they shouldn't go together. He's not going to be that good at saying whether or not he saw those pairs before. Okay, so his enhancement in remembering, something that he had experienced visually is only going to work if it's a meaningful word pair. So the expertise, these are all nice examples because it doesn't show that the expertise is any less kind of impressive or interesting. It just shows that it is specific to a domain of knowledge with which they studied to enhance their perception. I don't know if you can hear. There's the gardener here is out here in front of the garage, so it's going to be a little noisy for a couple of seconds. Hopefully, the fact that I'm wearing the mic will help. I apologize for this. It comes a different time and a different day every week, so it's always kind of a crapshoot. Okay. There's one other thing that experts can do that I think, with their domain of knowledge, that I think you'll find very interesting. It has to do with a concept called verbal overshadowing. Okay, so I'll get this sentence down first. Experts are able to overcome the verbal overshadowing effect. Okay? So let me tell you what the verbal overshadowing effect is. I'm going to give you a scenario that happened to me a long time ago. It's going to help you remember. It's a tiny bit scary, but it was a long time ago. I'm sure things are better now. But when I was living in Riverside, I was held up at gunpoint. It was actually in Moreno Valley. Okay. I'm sure Moreno Valley and Riverside are safer now than they were back then. It was like the mid 90s. Okay. There were parts where it could be a tiny bit dangerous. I was in front of a restaurant, an Italian restaurant. It wasn't a dangerous part of town, but yeah, it was dangerous adjacent, I guess you'd say. And I was getting out of the car with my friend, and somebody, all of a sudden, two people run up to us, and one is holding a gun, and they say, "Give us your money, give us your wallets and your purse." And it's funny. I don't know if hopefully you've never had this experience before, but when you first have an experience like this, you kind of almost interpret it as a joke because your experience with people doing something like this is when your friends kind of do it just to be silly, or you did it when you were kids. But very soon it clicks in that, oh my gosh, we have to follow exactly what they say. And I handed them my wallet. My friend handed them her purse, and they ran. Okay, we were fine, no problem. We were fine. We were a little shaken up. We went into the restaurant and told them what happened. They called the police. They gave us, wine, I think, to relax us. They were very kind about the whole thing, and we were fine. But it's just going to be a story to kind of explain this idea of verbal overshadowing. Here's what happened. The police came. They were very nice. They asked us to describe the perpetrators as best we could. And so we each did that and described their heights and their hair lengths and whether they had facial hair, tattoos, all that sort of stuff. We spent a good amount of time doing that. There was nobody there kind of trying to draw out a sketch artist or anything like that. They were just writing down the various traits we were describing. And then they got a call on the line and they said, hey, our colleague about a half a mile away just found these two guys running and they kind of fit the description. Would you mind going and seeing them? Sounds kind of scary. That's the last thing I want to do is kind of face these guys that just held us up at gunpoint. But we said, okay. And they said, don't worry, we're going to shine a light on them. It was at night by this time. We're going to shine a light on them. They're not going to be able to see in the car. Only you're going to be able to see them, and you're going to be in the back seat. So don't worry, they're not going to see you. And so we drive there, and they do exactly what they said they were going to do. There are these two guys there that kind of generally fit the description that we gave. But police turned around and said, okay, they do fit the description. Are these the guys that held you up? And they said, you need to be sure. I mean, you need to say, yes, I am certain they are the ones. And my friend and I look at each other and say, we can't be certain. Yeah, they fit the descriptions we gave you, but we can't be just certain. And so they had to let them go. They let them go. We didn't get our monies back or our wallets back or anything like that. But that experience of first describing something like a suspect and then being less able to recognize them is a known phenomenon. And in fact, it's a very, very well-known phenomenon and problem in eyewitness identifications in the real world, like this example is. Okay, what happened in these cases is my description, the fact that I described the perpetrators, then inhibited my ability to recognize them. Okay, it inhibited my ability to recognize them. And as I said, this is a very, very well-known phenomenon in eyewitness testimony, and police are very aware of this sort of thing. So yes, it is very helpful for them to have a verbal description, but they are aware that this is possibly some of the ramifications of what might happen. They might not, the witnesses might not be as good as they would have been if they hadn't given the description. Sometimes that's why they'll immediately bring in a sketch artist. They have ways of considering this sort of thing, but it is a very well-known thing. And it's not just something you can show in, anecdotes like I just gave you my own experience, but it's something that you can show in the lab very easily. You're showing 6 people, whether they're actually from a real lineup or not, doesn't really make much of a difference. You're asked to then describe them. Then you're shown the same 6 people, or you're shown 12 people and asked to pick out the ones that you had originally seen out of the 12, and you're going to be much worse at it if you had given a verbal description in between the time you originally saw the presentation set and then the test set. It's called the verbal overshadowing effect, that your verbal description overshadows your ability to then recognize them. Okay? That is true for all of us, whether we are looking at faces or if we're trying to remember wines, which is kind of interesting. It's not something, the verbal overshadowing effect is not just true for eyewitness testimony and remembering faces, it also works when we're trying to remember flavors and smells, by the way, too. And so these are all recognition tests in the laboratory. So let's do it with flavor. Let's do it with wine. I sip 6 wines, okay, and I give descriptions to each, the best I can do. I don't know, a sweet wine. This one's a little tart. I try to, do better than that. This one has kind of a woody flavor to it. I don't have the language or anything like that, okay? And then I'm given 12 wines and asked which of the 6 wines that I had before. I am going to be worse at that task because I had given descriptions to the 6 wines. If I had not given descriptions to the original 6 wines, I would be better at recognizing those 6 wines in that collection. I wouldn't be great, I'm sure, but I would have been better if I didn't give descriptions, okay? So that's absolutely true for someone like me who's a casual wine drinker. It is not true of someone like Steve Poe. He actually would not be inhibited by describing the wines. If anything, he would be enhanced. His memory would be enhanced at describing wines. And that's true not just of Steve Poe as an expert wine drinker, but it would be true of expert chess players, expert coaches, musicians, circuit designers, all those folks. Of course, all these things have to follow the rules of each of those domains, but it's true in general that experts are able to overcome the verbal overshadowing effect. It's actually an interesting question. I don't know if I asked this in the book, but I'm wondering if there's any literature showing that real face experts, people that are used to describing faces all the time, okay, and have ways of kind of systematically applying descriptions. So who would do that? I don't know. I guess maybe people who did the drawings of suspects, of perpetrators. Sketch artists might be really good at this and might be able to overcome the verbal overshadowing effect with faces. I don't know that literature, but it's interesting that at least for all these other domains, for chess playing, for coaching, music, composing, circuit design, and of course Steve Poe, their explicit expertise allows them to avoid verbal overshadowing, which I think is really, really interesting. Okay, let's take a quick break and see if there's questions and do a test question. Cool, looks like there's a few questions. Oops. Great. Nassim says, yes, they are. Not sure what you're pertaining to then, Nassim? Sorry, I don't look at the comments until we take our break, so that's okay, unless you want to tell me the details. But Kimberly asks, I wonder if this applies to pieces that are following the rules but are used in very unlikely. Okay, Kimberly, you're asking about the chess playing, right? The chess experts, whether if they can still remember a chessboard piece location, if in fact they follow the rules but are in positions that are unlikely, such as if someone only moves some of their pawns and then just kept bouncing their knight around. Oh, wow, that's great. Okay, so if they were bad chess players, I guess, or were intentionally trying to create a board that didn't make sense. That's a very interesting question, Kimberly. I would bet they would still be able to remember it, but maybe not as good. I mean, as soon as the rules are deviated, that's going to be a real problem for the chess expert. But maybe if in fact the rules aren't deviated, but the chess playing just isn't very strategic, they're not using kind of typical sorts of strategies, if that would make it more difficult. That's a great question. I bet that answer's in the literature somewhere. You might just want to look it up really quickly to see. I don't think you have to go to the actual scientific literature. It might be in the kind of just chess playing blogs or something like that. It's a really good question. All right, any other questions about this? Great questions we're getting today. Thank you so much for the questions. It's fun. Okay, let's do some polling. And good. This will be perfect. We just talked about this. This will be a good question for you folks. Oh, shoot. All right. I'll read it with you. I'll give you a little extra time. I didn't mean to post it so quickly. Which of the following is true of wine experts? They have better taste thresholds for wine. They have better taste discrimination for wine. They have advanced activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine, or all of the above. Okay. Think carefully about this one, everybody. Remember what I said on the 2 slides ago, maybe 3 slides ago? And I'll give you a little more than a minute since I forgot to read it before I posted it. Okay, looks like most of you are done. Good. I'm glad we asked this one. This is a good one for you to have ready for your exam. Okay, that's a little more than a minute. Let's end this and share the results. And the correct answer is C. So go ahead and take a picture of that. Which of the following is true of wine experts? Now, remember from a few slides ago, I said that they did not have better taste thresholds. It's not like they can tell whether a drop of wine has been put in water better than I can tell whether a drop of wine is put in water. Their threshold for detecting wine is the same. Better discrimination? No. Actually, I guess people that aren't experts are pretty good at determining whether 2 wines are the same or different, 2 glasses of wine are the same or different, and are no worse than people like Stephen Poe at determining that sort of thing. However, Steve Poe and wine experts certainly have that enhanced activity in language and memory brain areas when sipping wine. That is one of the things that really distinguishes these folks. They show enhanced activity in the analytical parts, the more left brain parts, and more specifically in their language areas and memory areas when they're sipping wine. So that is one thing that absolutely distinguishes them neurophysiologically from the rest of us. And the answer can't be all of the above because A and B aren't true. Okay, it is one of those questions. I'm glad I remembered to ask this one, that even though all of the above is often a Rosenblum sort of answer on these tests, in this example, it's not. So make sure you read the questions carefully and don't always assume it's all the above or both A, B, and B or whatever, just because that is one possible answer. Okay, great. Any questions on this? Any questions? We doing good? Because that's it. That's not it for today. Oh no, I got to teach every second when you're in summer class, but that is it for your exam. Everything so far today will be on your midterm. Everything from here on in, though, after 11:07 or whatever it is, or 12:07, will be on your final, because we are now switching our topic to touch. And why don't we go ahead and do that? Oh, hold on a second. Sorry. Yes, I need to get rid of this and switch and post. Okay. This was another great, fun interview I did. This is a terrific guy named John Bramblett. And John is blind, completely blind. He lost his sight, I believe, when he was in his 20s. Maybe a little younger than that. He started losing his sight earlier, but decided, as you'll soon hear from him, to start painting as a way of kind of taking control of his life after he went blind. Obviously he can't use sight to paint like most painters do. He uses his sense of touch. And I think understanding some things about John is going to allow us to understand some things about how the brain compensates for loss. We've talked a little bit about this, about how the brain of Daniel Kish will use its visual region to enhance its sense of hearing. We're going to start talking about this in its most technical ways soon, but I think John Bramblett will help us understand this by how he has systematically allowed his sense of touch to become more sensitive to compensate for his blindness. And I have a little video here, and I'm hoping it works okay. If nothing else, you'll be able to hear him, I believe.
My sight went very slowly at first. I didn't even realize it when I first noticed I was having trouble with my sight. I was already really twice over the legal limit for being blind. There were just less and less things I could do. I couldn't go out as much, or if I did, I needed assistance. There were so many things I couldn't do. I just had a lot of anger building up. And I didn't even realize I was that angry, but I started painting. I don't know, so much as an outlet or a way of defiance in a way. Something that is viewed as very visual. After a while, I started becoming less and less angry. The more I painted, the more I could let that out, and to where now it just I have to paint. Starting painting was sort of a crazy thing in a way. I mean, I decided I just was going to do it. I couldn't write. I didn't have a computer at the time that could read to me. I feel like if I didn't have some sort of creative outlet, I was going to go crazy. I just needed to put something out there. In a way, it was out of anger. I mean, it was a way of giving a middle finger to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. Saying, well, I may not be visual, but I'm still going to do this. I'm still going to try. And I really didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it was visually appealing. I just wanted to do it. I thought the physical action of painting, of putting what's in my mind out there, actually in the physical world, even if no one else liked it, I wanted to create something like that. It's really what got me into it. And I went and got some oil paints and just started. I told my mom that I started painting, and she was like, "Oh, that's great." she was so worried when her and my dad came over one day, and she wanted to be so supportive, and she didn't want to let me down, but she was so relieved when she looked at it. She liked it. She actually liked it. The reason I lost my vision is I have a seizure disorder. I've had it ever since I was a kid. The seizure will start in the front, and it'll hit the back where the occipital lobe is, because you actually see back here the optic nerve travels from your eyes around to the very back. So that my eyes work, I get light in, but the brain, the part that deciphers the image, doesn't know what to make with it. So it's sort of like a TV that you have on, but there's no signal, there's no antenna or cable or anything attached. So it's just like it's just slow. It's just from the seizure, which is rare, it turns out. So, but if you have enough of them, you'll do it. The main problem when doing the painting, if you can't see it visually, is keeping oriented on the canvas and knowing exactly where you are and what you've done. I'm always drawn using pencils or pens, but you can't feel pencils or pen strokes once you put them down. And so I started using Elmer's glue because it dries and it's hard, but Elmer's glue takes about a day to dry. So whenever you make one line, you've got to wait about a day to go back and fill it again. So then I started using the whiteout pen, and that makes a very nice line that you can fill. But if you paint it on canvas, over time it seeps into the canvas, so your drawing will disappear. And now I use this stuff called slick paint, and it dries really, really fast. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, and you can feel it. It orients you to the painting, and that's really all you need. That's all a person who likes to do, whatever they're painting. Probably the next hardest thing was colors. But with oil paint, the great thing about oil paints is that they're all made with different substances, and it gives them a different viscosity and different texture. The white, it almost feels like caulk or toothpaste. It's very thick, very, very viscous. And black is almost runny. It still has a thickness to it, but compared to white, it's almost like oil. If you were to mix half white and half black, the feeling and the viscosity is somewhere halfway in between. So you can just start working from there. Sometimes I'll decide on the colors because I like the way it feels. When I first started, I painted very, very slowly. I would make a small sketch, and it would take me 8 hours to make one little sketch. I sped up quite a bit. And part of it is just I can remember a lot more. Like whenever my hand goes over the drawing, I can feel the lines, and then I remember where they are, and then my other, over time I've learned to follow it a little bit more exact. One hand sort of to see the canvas, and the other hand to fill in the paint. It's hard to tell sometimes when you have a lot going on in painting if it's actually working or if the colors are very good. It's nice to have an artist that you go talk to, someone that you can talk to that you can say, is this actually the color that I was going for? And then you'll be able to say yes or not.
Okay, terrific. Yeah, there's more of that. I can post it on our YouTube site if you want, if you're interested in this type of thing. But I think that covers a lot of what I'm going to end up talking about, which is how he uses his sense of touch to do this. I think it's just really interesting. There's some of his work. By the way, if you get a chance, go to his site. He's really become such an accomplished artist. He's able to support him and his wife, who you just saw there. That was his wife he was working with. I think when I interviewed him, he had just had a child. I think they've since had another child. And he is doing really well. And his art has just, kind of become more and more impressive as time has gone on. And he paints, he paints lots of different things. He paints from his memory. He paints from subjects like his doggy, who he said to make that little, what is that, a boxer? He touched the boxer's face for a long time. The boxer was fine with it. And from touching the boxer's face, he's able to recreate it with his paintings. And he does the same thing with human models as well. And then he has tried to kind of conveyed some of his more kind of emotional world through his paintings in his experiential world. So he still does have some seizure disorders, sadly, and he has a set of paintings that he feels kind of, I guess, portray what those are like, and it's very powerful stuff. If you get a chance, I recommend you take a look at it. It's interesting. So I think you learned a lot about him. He went blind, I guess, pretty much completely blind by the time he was 25. He had started losing his sight before then. He had very little painting experience, just the sort of experience you might get from elementary school or whatever. However, his mom's a painter by hobby, so that was one of the reasons he had some of the equipment accessible to him after this happened. But there might be something there genetically about his ability to paint. But his mom's a fairly accomplished painter, not as successful as John. Doesn't make it her livelihood, but it's interesting that was the case. You saw a little bit about his technique. What he uses now is something called slick paint, or I think he called it, but puffy paint is often its term. And what it is it's a type of paint that's sometimes used to make designs on like clothing. It kind of leaves a little raised white line very often. I guess it comes in different colors, but I think he uses one that's white. And what you do is you kind of spread it on the canvas, and it leaves enough of a raised line that it can be felt. So after he decides what he wants to paint, he'll first do the kind of simple drawing using the puffy paint on a piece of paper, and then when he gets the canvas ready, he will then kind of blow up that image so it ends up being on a big canvas. Again, he'll kind of transfer the line drawing he made on the paper to the canvas, again using the puffy paint. So this now allows him to feel the outline of what he'll be drawing, the subject he'll be drawing, whether it's a church or his doggy's face or somebody else's face or something like that. And as you saw there, by the way, this video is about 10 years old now, I think. He's now actually much better than what you saw, both in terms of his technique and I think is the result in artwork, which is interesting. But I'm going to tell you how he used to do it first, and then what he's doing now, which is really astonishing how quickly and how efficiently he's allowed to paint. So what he used to do is be able to follow the puffy paint with his left hand as he then kind of painted in between the lines with his right hand. So basically, he's kind of following an outline by feeling it with one hand as he's painting with the other hand. And you kind of saw him do that in the video. It kind of gives you some sense of this. And you also heard him mention that he uses oil paints. And I don't know if any of you have experienced painting enough so you know what oil paints are like, but not a whole lot of people use oil paints anymore. Certainly most hobbyists don't, because they're really messy, as it turns out. They're hard to get out of clothing, hard to get off the floor if you drip some. Most people use acrylic paint, but he uses oil-based paint for a very particular reason. He says that oil-based paints, unlike acrylic paints, each have a different consistency that can be felt. So he mentioned there that when he has white and black on his palette, Felt the white and said it's kind of like a toothpaste. He felt the black, and it's kind of like oil, like a slick oil. And that difference in the consistency, and if you did it yourself, you'd feel the difference too. That difference in the consistency is something that's true of oil paints. Acrylics don't have that kind of distinct feel to them. Oil paints are what we say is tactily, meaning that they're distinct in how they feel when you touch them with your fingers. And what that allows him to do then is to not only determine what paints he's going to be, going to choose to paint on the canvas, but then to mix paints. Say he wants to add a gray to the canvas, a dark gray. What he'll do is he'll take some of the white pasty paint and the black slicky paint and mix them together, and the resultant mixture will then be felt, and if it's more on the pasty side, then he knows it's more a light gray. If it's more on the slicky side, he'll know it's a dark gray and say, oh, that's what I want, okay, and then he'll apply that to the canvas. So he's able to feel the paint and know the color more or less, which is really interesting, and know the color to the extent that he's able to mix paints this way. So he is able to mix paints through touch, is what I'm saying. And as I said, so he feels the raised lines with his non-brush hand. I already said that, I guess. He follows the line with his left hand. And that's what you saw him do 10 years ago on that video. He doesn't do that anymore, okay? Actually, so he had said when I interviewed him, well, I guess maybe what you saw was more 10 years ago, because when I interviewed him 10 years ago, he said, I don't really need to touch the paints anymore. It's messy. It's hard for me to make sure when I wash my hands, I get all the paint off. And so I don't touch the paints directly that much anymore. I'm able to paint without touching the canvas with my left hand now. How is he able to do that? Okay. Question. The other thing he's able to do is he's able to tell the mixture of his paints as well as the color of his paints without touching them directly with his skin. How is he able to do that? Well, let's address the second question first. These days, he can determine the color and the mixture by just taking his brush and kind of wiping it through the paint. Okay, so this hand stays clean. The only thing that's going to get paint on it is the brush. And what he'll be able to do is by kind of carefully feeling what's happening with the brush as he's wiping it through the paint, he'll be able to tell what color it is. If it takes a little bit more effort to wipe it through, he might know that's a white. If it takes less effort, if he can wipe it through and it seems kind of slick when he wipes his paint through, he'll know it's a black. He then mixes them together with his brush, and the resultant mixture will either be a dark gray or a light gray, depending on what he feels the resistance to the brush is like. Right? If it's thick, if it's a light gray and it's thicker, there'll be more resistance as he kind of, pulls his brush across that paint. If there's less resistance and it's kind of slippery, he knows that it's a dark gray. So he doesn't need to get his left hand dirty anymore. He doesn't need to directly touch the paint anymore, which is amazing. And that's also true of when he's actually applying paint to the canvas. So before I said that he needed to touch the raised lines to know where to put the paint with his painting hand, his brush holding hand. He doesn't even need to know that anymore, because when he's painting with his right hand, he can feel the little nubs of the puffy paint where they are by feeling how those little nubs, those little ridges, kind of resist his movements. Okay, so he can feel where those ridges are as he's moving the brush up and down, kind of as the little ridges resist his movements. And I guess that sort of vibration gets transferred up to his hand that's holding the brush. So he can basically use the brush almost like it's part of his body now, and determine where the raised lines are, and can determine the color of the paints that he's mixing, which is just amazing. And we're going to talk about that, I think, next week probably, the idea of something called proxy touch, and that's using tools to be like kind of extensions of our body. whether it's a paintbrush, whether it's a spoon when you're mixing soup and trying to determine how thick it is, whether you're using a screwdriver and feeling how tight the screw is in there, that type of thing. These are all examples of using tools as extensions of our body that I'm calling proxy touch, which we'll get back into. But I think this is just a phenomenal example of proxy touch, where now he's using the brush to be able to feel the resistances of the raised lines, the resistances of the paints on his palette, and being able to identify what color it is and where he needs to paint based on those raised lines. It's amazing. Amazing story. As I said, he paints from memory. So that church right there was painted from the memory of when he was seeing, when he was a seeing person. And that was the church he went to when he was quite young. He did it from memory. First drew it out on a piece of paper using the puffy paint, and then expanded it into a large, easel, onto a large easel with the canvas. And he also uses models. And this is where things got really interesting. I think all this is really interesting, of course, but he said something very interesting. He said that when I paint a model, whether it's my doggie or my wife, or something like a still life where I would paint a table and the fruit sitting on the table and maybe a wine bottle, which he does, I feel it, and in some ways I think that I am in some ways experiencing more detail in the objects I'm painting than I would if I were actually seeing. And you could imagine this, right? Let's get something up here that you could feel. Oh yeah, this is great. This is a very complex object. Why do I have this here? Do you know what this is? This is a what's called a talking drum. It's just, I have a whole bunch of instruments. I kind of collect instruments from different countries, and this is a talking drum. And it's called talking because you can kind of hear it. It's supposed to talk a little. It sounds like it's talking a little bit. Okay, that sort of thing. The pitch goes up when you squeeze it. But I'm really pulling this up because it's a very complex object. And I could look at this and paint it, or I could feel it and then paint it. And if you can see how kind of textured this thing is, I mean, these are, I guess, strings. These are strings that have a very, very unique texture. This up here is a skin, an animal skin, that has a very unique texture. And I can look at this and try to replicate it, but feeling all this, and then inside the wood frame, feeling all these things might very well give me detail that seeing something won't. And here's where he believes he has a contribution to make to art students and to sighted folks that are trying to learn art. That not just looking at a subject, but touching a subject might give you a very different perspective on the things that you're painting, especially if it's a still life and you can touch objects on a table, or if it's a model, you're touching your doggie's face, you're touching your wife's skin, something like that. There are things that can be apprehended through touch and be transferred into a painting that might not be as noticeable when looking at a painting. Okay, so he has actually taught painting. He does teach painting in both blind schools and sighted schools. He'll teach some painting to blind kids, and it's fun for their families and stuff like that. But he does some fairly serious teaching in regular art schools for sighted pupils. And he said that one of the things that I think is most useful is for them to start thinking about art as more than a visual medium. What do you mean? Well, I mean that, kind of like we just said, I will first put an apple on a stool and ask people to paint it in the class, okay? And they'll all do it, and, they're students, they'll all paint a nice apple. It will look maybe different from the different angles, but it's an apple. And then what he'll do is he'll pass around the apple and ask people to close their eyes and feel the apple. And after they're done doing that, he'll put the apple away. They can't see it anymore, but then ask them to open their eyes and then paint the apple they just felt. And at that point, every painting will be very different from the next. People, when they feel an object, will have a different sort of experience that in some ways might even be more personal to them. In some ways touches a more personal sense than seeing something at a distance, right? It's a more intimate sense. And that kind of closeness, that intimacy with a touched object will be reflected in the painting, which is really interesting. You don't think of paintings being like that. I paint something I see, and then you see my painting. But he's saying, let's think about first painting something that you see and then touch, and see how those things are then reflected in a painting that you can see. Or see and touch, which is something else he's been interested in. He, of course, when he tries to, kind of remind himself of his old paintings, you saw him looking, I think, doing this in part of the video, he would actually touch some of his old paintings. And it's cool because, especially for oil paints, I believe this is true, the dried paint will feel different depending on the paint, the color paint that's used. So not only does wet white paint feel pasty, dried white paint will feel more blobby when it's dried, okay? Where the black paint, which is slicker when it's wet, will also seem smoother when it's dried. So when he goes to an old painting that's been dried for some time, he can feel the colors to some degree that he used. He says it's harder to feel the colors when the paints are dry, but I can tell I used a lot of white here, or I can tell I used a lot of black here, that sort of thing, and other colors to some degree too. And based on his kind of notoriety, he's actually had a chance to touch some very famous artists' paintings. So he said there was a couple of times that art collectors, not museums, but art collectors who had famous paintings in their collection would invite him over and ask if he wanted to touch the paintings. And he has touched the paintings, literally touched the paintings of Cézanne, Rembrandt, and Van Gogh, as just some examples. And if you go to a museum and try doing this, they are not cool with it, as well they shouldn't be. I mean, it's not great for the painting. If everyone went in and touched the painting would be ruined. But, if you own the painting yourself, and, it's been touched a couple of times since you've had it, that ain't a big deal. And so, collectors, very wealthy collectors, I assume, will invite him over to touch the paintings. And he said it's been an amazing experience for him because he really can feel, he can feel the colors a little bit, but more importantly than that, he can feel the techniques that are used and the painterly techniques, like how the painter applied the brush to the canvas. And you can see these are very different sorts of styles of painting. Look at Van Gogh, for example. My gosh, can you imagine all the little strokes Van Gogh used to get the texture of the grass down here, where Cézanne doesn't use kind of like these very kind of, almost violent strokes. Things are much more kind of continuous, and certainly with Rembrandt, there's a lot of detail there, but the color and the lighting, how that changes gradually, is a very different technique in painting. And that's something he can feel. He can feel the dried brush strokes, essentially, as he feels these different paintings. It says it kind of connects him to the artist in a way that he believes looking at the painting might not. In all fairness, when he's there, he will ask the owners of these paintings to describe the painting to him and say, oh yeah, down here, this is Van Gogh, it's got grass down here, and this is the sky, and here's the mountain and stuff like that. So he'll have a sense of what the content is. It's not like he can read the painting's themes or something like that by touching the brush strokes, the dried brush strokes. He needs someone to tell him what the painting is of, certainly. But he's able to possibly tell something about what the artist was trying to do in the technique they were using. So he says when he touches a Van Gogh, things seem really edgy. Things seem really almost violent and anxious in his technique. And you can look at that and kind of see that's the case too, in a way, right? But he says by feeling it, he thinks that he has a connection to the artist that just looking at it doesn't. When he touches a Cézanne, things are a little bit smoother. Things seem like a little bit, more relaxed than they would in a Van Gogh. And he feels that's something he gets through touching, which is a really interesting sort of concept. I think it's a really cool way of thinking about painting. So let's take a quick break here. And before we get into some of the technical details of what might be going on with John and see if there's any questions. Looks like there's a question. And then ask a practice question. Yes. Okay, so William asks, does someone tell John what colors to use, or does he? Oh, that's a great. I'm so glad you reminded me of this, William. So how does John pick his colors? He does know what colors he's using, absolutely. And don't forget, he has 20 years or so of visual experience, so he knows what colors things should be. Okay, right? So he knows that, doggy faces should be this color, and people's faces should be this color, and churches should be this color. However, if you noticed about the paintings I showed you, or if you go on his website, you will see that a lot of his paintings seem very almost psychedelic, that the colors are very vivid often, and they don't really match the sort of colors of how those things would appear in the real world. That is intentional on John's part. What John will do sometimes when he's, say, painting his wife's face, is he will feel around her face and will feel the textures and the oils on her face. I mean, you can imagine how sensitive his sense of touch has become. And he'll decide, well, this part is maybe particularly slick here, so maybe I will use a paint that feels slick. So even though he knows this deviates from how we see the world, he will often choose the paints that have the most in common with the texture of the things he's feeling. For whatever reason, white paint is thick and black paint is thin. And, it's kind of arbitrary to a certain degree. They don't really have that much to do with the actual color, but he'll choose the paints he's going to use on that part of the painting based on how it felt. So he just thinks it's kind of a cool way of, being different in his painting, not choosing colors by how they look, but choosing colors by how they feel. I'm so glad you asked that question, because I had forgotten to mention that. I'm sure it's in the book, but I think it's such a cool idea. So that's why his paintings look like the colors are so kind of psychedelic or almost, or kind of wild. The color choice is very wild in some ways. Thank you for asking that question, William. Other questions about John Bramblett? Other questions about John? Okay. Then let's do one more practice question here. And it will be something on your, previous, we'll do something on taste, because this will be on your exam. This should be easy. This is going to be easy, but you get a free question, so it's fine. This has to do with the sound of food. The louder and brighter your crunching sound is to you. The louder and brighter your crunching sounds to you, A, the more you'll like a potato chips taste. B, the less you'll like a potato chips taste. C, the less you'll like a carrot taste. Or D, both B and C. Be careful here. It's a little tricky on this one. I don't like myself for asking it this way, but I think you know the answer. The lighter and brighter your crunching sounds to you, will you like the thing more or less? And then choose it based on that. Okay, you're doing good. A few more seconds here. Most of you got this. Good. I'm glad that you weren't tricked by my evil intents. Okay, I think we can end it here. I will share the results. The correct answer is A. Most of you got it. Remember, if it is a loud, crunchy sound when it comes to a potato chip, you will like it better. You will absolutely like it better. You'll like the taste better, and that you'll also think it's fresher. That's good. If it's loud and bright, B has to be wrong because A is correct. So it's not true the less you like it. It's true of carrots too, as it turns out, that the more you will like it more. So think about it this way. You know, you have the answer right there in front of you when you take the test, of course, but, you know, just to kind of make it conceptually memorable for you. If it's bright, if it's a loud sound as you're crunching, it's going to sound fresher regardless of what it is, and you're going to like it more. So I asked it in a tricky way, and I apologize. I'm evil. But the correct answer is A. It is not both B and C or B or C. Okay. Let me know if there's any questions on this, if anyone has any problems with that. Take a quick picture if you haven't. And there we go. Good. All right. Okay, any other questions about anything? Should we go on? All right, no problem. Now, we are gonna, the John Bramlett stuff is great. It's really fun and interesting, but we are gonna now get a tiny bit more technical. No problems, we've just got 10 minutes left in the class. You can take a quick breath and we will go ahead and dive into this because what I'm most interested in here is based on John Bramlett's astonishing sensitivity to touch, you know, whether it comes to touching paint directly with skin or using a tool to touch the paint and touch the raised lines on his canvas, he really has learned to use his sensuous touch to compensate for his loss of vision. It's a great example for that. And as it turns out, there's a good amount of research on this type of thing, on blindness and touch. So do the blind have a better sense of touch than sighted people? And I can tell you right away, the answer is yes. The blind do have a better sense of touch. And in fact, so good, so much better that it compensates for our general, universal loss of touch sensitivity as we grow older. Okay, I don't know if you know about this, but this is an issue for the elderly. They have less of a acute sense of touch than they did when they were younger. And this is the problem, you know, sometimes older people are more likely to fall. We're talking about people in their 70s and 80s. They're more likely to fall. And part of the reason they're thought to have this problem is because they don't get the feedback on the soles of their feet as they're walking that the rest of us have, that people that aren't that old have. So as you get older, your sense of touch on your skin, whether it's on your hand or body or your feet, becomes less sensitive. Okay. If that happens to the feet, what's going to happen is you're not going to be able to feel the ground as easily. And that is considered to be at least one of the factors that causes old people to fall more readily than young people. Okay. However, blind people don't seem to have this type of problem with loss of sensitivity. They do lose a little bit, but not nearly as much. In fact, a blind person who is 75 years old will have the touch sensitivity of somebody who's sighted and 50 years old. Okay, so I am in my late 50s, hard to admit, but I'm in my late 50s and I don't have the touch sensitivity I did when I was 25, but I certainly have good touch sensitivity and better than it will be for me when I'm 75. But when one is blind, they actually have learned to compensate for their blindness by somehow enhancing their touch sensitivity. And it counteracts what I'm trying to say here about the age of touch sensitivity and how it changes. If one is blind, they kind of counteract that decline by 25 years. So a blind person who is 75 has the touch sensitivity of somebody who is 50, somebody who's sighted, that's 50. Yeah, in fact, a 75-year-old blind individual will have better touch sensitivity than I do as being somebody who is 58, okay? Just to give you some idea. Why? Why would that be the case? And you know, maybe you know a little bit about blind and the fact that blind use Braille, right? You know what Braille is? Do I have an example of Braille here? Oh, I'm going to get one. I'll bring it next class because we will be talking more about it. But you know what Braille looks like? It's raised dots on a paper or raised dots on signs. Usually when I'm teaching this in in lecture halls, I'll go up to one of the signs on the side of the room that have a room number on it, and under every single sign that has a number or text on it across campus, at the bottom, you'll see there's Braille. There's those little raised dot patterns that the blind can use to read. It's pretty great, you know, and it exists, I think, in most signs on the campuses across all the UCs and probably the Cal States at the very least. It's, you know, something that's been requested and supported by the university. But the question is, could that be the reason that all blind people have this greater sense of touch, that they've learned to use Braille and that's enhanced their sense of touch? Well, you know, you're probably thinking, you know, Braille might enhance your sense of touch here, but would it really have an effect on your feet? And that's good thinking. The other thing you have to know about Braille is, yeah, it's true. Probably most blind individuals on our campus and on college campuses across the country do know Braille. But that's sadly a very small proportion of the blind. Sadly, most blind individuals do not go to college. In fact, very few, relatively speaking, very few blind people actually know Braille. It's only 10% of the population, and it's actually decreasing a little bit now too, because of the technologies the blind have available to them. And it used to be the only way to, you know, get the information in a newspaper, the information in a book or a magazine or something like that, unless somebody made a recording, you know, a verbal recording. But nowadays, with, you know, computers that can read text out loud, you know, Siri can read your papers to you, and you know, Alexa can do the same sort of thing. It's, you know, it's a computer voice. It doesn't sound perfect, but it's absolutely useful. I mean, it's absolutely something that can be used. The blind don't need to use Braille nearly as much as they used to. And so it is not because of Braille that they have this heightened touch sensitivity. What's believed to be the cause is something that we know now about brains that are sensory deprived, something called cross-modal plasticity. And it's kind of a technical term. We might have used this term before, now that I think about it. It's just the idea that when one sense degrades, the other senses can kind of compensate for it. And that's what's going on with touch sensitivity and the blind. That when one loses their sight, their sense of touch, and as you might remember, to some degree, their sense of hearing will be heightened a little bit, will be enhanced a little bit in order to compensate for that loss. Why is that the case? I will wait and tell you that answer next class after your exam. Good luck, everybody, on your exam. You know, take it whenever you want until Sunday. And if you have questions, ask Serena if she can't answer them. I'd be happy to answer them too. Okay? Good luck.